I'm Brad Rodriguez from Fix This Build That, and today I'm going to show you how to make a wooden bottle stopper. Now it's an easy project to make on the lathe for beginners just like myself. Stay tuned, I'll show you exactly how I did it. How does this thing even work? Today I'm kicking off 6 days of beginner wood turning videos. I'm going to launch a new video each day of a turning project any beginner can make. And this is my first time making most of these projects, so you're going to see my mistakes and the things that I learned along the way. I'll have a link in the description to the playlist for all 6 videos so you can check out the whole series. Now let's get turning. I'm starting off this project with a mahogany turning blank that was about 2 by 2 by 5 inches long. I marked the center of the blank on both ends and then I indented them with a scratch awl. I centered the drive spur and I hammered it into the blank with a dead blow mallet. I'll be roughing out the blank using the drive spur in the headstock and a live center in the tailstock. I mounted the piece in the lathe and then I tightened everything up and positioned my tool rest so I could start turning. I'm using my 1221 VS lathe by Jet, the sponsor of today's video, to do the turning. My old mini lathe was just 3 speeds and this variable speed is a real game changer. I started out the roughing with this square radius carbide tool. I like it a bit better than just the square tool for roughing as it doesn't catch on those hard corners as much. I'll be mounting the blank into a chuck next, so I cut a tenon for the chuck jaws. It had been a while since I last turned, and here's my first mistake you'll see in just a second. I took the spur drive out of the headstock and put on my midi chuck. Now you can pick up one of these for under $100, and a chuck is almost a must-have for wood turning. I'll have a link down below in the description to this one, as well as all the other tools that I'm going to use today. I tried to clamp the tenon in the chuck, but I had reduced the diameter a little too much and it was too small for the chuck jaw inserts I had. Now luckily the other end fit just right, so I tightened it in the chuck and while I was still in business. I removed the live center from the tailstock and I put in a Jacob's chuck. This is similar to what you would find on a drill press. I'll use this chuck to drill a centered hole into the blank. Then I can mount it on the turning mandrel and thread the bottle stopper hardware on later. I drilled the hole with a bit slightly smaller than 3/8 of an inch, so I can tap the threads with a 3/8 inch tapping mandrel next. Now wood turning projects require a lot of swapping parts for specific operations, but the nice thing is once you have a few of these key parts, you can do a ton of different turning projects. I did the old swaparoo again, and this time I put the Jacob's chuck in the headstock and mounted the 3/8 of an inch tapping mandrel into it. I mounted the blank on the chuck, which also tapped the threads for me. I reinstalled the live center and then I turned the lathe on and pushed in the tailstock to support the piece. And make sure you lock the tailstock down firmly. If you start to feel any wobble, just tighten it up a little bit more. Now here's where the fun begins. I started turning the cylinder into its final shape. I used the square radius tool to hog off a lot of the material, then I switched to the round carbide tool to make some curves. I love turning because it's just so organic. The shapes I end up with are rarely what I imagined going in, and I just remove the material until it looks pleasing to my eye. With the rough shape established, I used a slim parting tool to remove some excess material, and then I cut the rest off with a pull saw. I could have just parted the whole thing off with that parting tool, but it was a bit nervous, honestly. I moved the tailstock out of the way so that I could position my tool rest and get full access to the end of the bottle stopper. Using the round tool, I finished off the top just how I wanted it. So I moved on to sanding. I use these little Woodturner sandpaper strips, and I start with 150 grit and go up to 600 grit. It's kind of nice because the lathe does all the work turning, you just move the paper around and just get into all the nooks and crannies. And one thing I learned was to make sure that you sand with the direction of the grain before moving on to the next grit. This seems to help hide the sanding marks a little more easily. Now here's a sneak peek of day 2 in my 6 days of beginner wood turnings. I used red heart and it was an amazing wood to turn. This red color is just mesmerizing and I love how the end product turned out. Make sure you check the description or the end of the video for the link to the 6 days of beginner wood turning playlist. I took off the piece to do a dry fit of the bottle stopper before finished, then I realized another oversight. The mandrel I used was not made specifically for this bottle stopper kit and it had a wider diameter than the bottle stopper I was using. So there was this nasty looking transition between the wood and the metal that I needed to take care of. I basically just needed to space the stopper away from the mandrel enough so that I could use a detail tool to shape the end. After some brainstorming, I grabbed the offcut from the top of the blank and I cut a circular spacer off on the bandsaw. I took this piece to the drill press and I drilled a hole in it so I could mount it on the mandrel. And it screwed right on and it did exactly what I needed it to. The stopper seemed to hold fine enough with just enough threads on that mandrel also. I turned the spacer down near the size of the stopper with the round tool, and then I switched over to the detail tool to make the final cuts to size. I set a pair of calipers to the diameter of the stopper hardware, and I used the calipers to check how close I was until I got just to the right size. I did another test of the stopper and it turned out just right. And that angled transition matched the top perfectly. Bob Ross would be proud of this happy little mistake. I'm using a water-based wood turner's finish to seal the stopper. I got this bottle of finish when I first started turning, and I love the results, so I've actually never used anything else. I applied a heavy coat which soaks in pretty quickly to the end grain, and I applied about 4 or 5 more coats. In between coats, I sanded with these little micro mesh sanding pads. They do a great job of roughing up the finish but not giving any scratch marks. I used the 1800, 2400, and 3200 before each new coat. The buildup goes pretty quick since this is a water-based finish, and I only waited about 15 minutes, if that, in between coats. After the final coat, I used the micro mesh and sanded all the way up through the different pads up to the 12,000 pad. It gives a great satin finish that's not too shiny and it just feels a little bit more natural to me. If you want a gloss look, you could use a wax and buff that out as well. I twisted on the stopper and man, it turned out awesome. This is a really cool little project and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. It's a great way to get into starting turning small things. I want to give a big thank you to Jet Woodworking for partnering with me on this build. That Jet 1221 that I used is an awesome machine. There's a link down below in the description where you can go check it out. Make sure you stay tuned for the rest of my 6 days of beginner wood turning projects. There's a playlist right over here. There's a link down below also in the description. You can go check out all the different projects that I'm going to be making. Until next time, guys, get out there and build something awesome.